Okay, it should be recording now. Thanks, Tony Lynn. And here we'll go with the second attempt at share screen. And hopefully you see my. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. All right, well, welcome everyone. And we are now in the second of 3 networking events that the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network is hosting. The topic of our conversation today is on embracing the future through resistance, resilience, and transformation. And we can put a link in the chat for those of you who have not been able to access the document yet. But really, this is just an opportunity for everybody to get together and share your experiences, to ask questions of each other. It's really casual. We want everybody to turn on your cameras and participate as much as possible. The only thing we ask, we are going to start off with a brief presentation, just an overview. And then from there, everybody can unmute and take turns. We'd like you to use your hand raising, and Carrie Marshner, my colleague from RISC, who's going to be facilitating today, can walk you through that. You're also welcome to put your comments in the chat. But I just wanted to kick this off by giving a quick plug, first of all, for our 3rd event that's going to be hosted on May 5th from 12 to 1:15 in collaboration with the Mass ECAN to talk with managers and other decision makers about climate change and invasive species, as well as researchers. But I did want to just give a quick overview for those of you who aren't familiar with RISC. The RISC was founded back in 2016, and it was inspired by questions from managers, that invasive species managers, who were realizing that climate change was impacting invasive species, but didn't have the scientific information they wanted to help guide their decisions. And so with that, the network was founded by my colleague Bethany Bradley and Tony Lynn Morelli, who's with us this morning to kick off this meeting. And since then, it's grown to over 600 invasive species researchers and managers in our network. And we have a great leadership team of practitioners, researchers, and extension folks from UMass, from Cornell, and from other organizations throughout the Northeast. The mission of the
in Swan Island, regardless.
If everyone
Swan
could
Island,
mute their lines.
No. State park.
Okay,
pretty
like
cool.
The big one,
it's
right?
the big one that's
Yeah.
like right adjacent to Richmond.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's within 50 yards. Of
Justin, if you can do the mute
go
line thing.
To it.
Perfect. Okay, so the mission of the RISC is to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. Oops. And if you're interested in seeing how the RISC was formed, we have a guidance document on our website. But basically, we work in 4 main areas. So we work with boundary spanning to bring together the researcher and manager worlds. We conduct original research that's based on the requests of our network and of managers who are working in the field. We take up-to-date science and we translate it and synthesize it so that it's easily accessible to those who need it. And we also facilitate communication, and things like this networking networking session you're in today is one of those as well. And for those of you who aren't in the Northeast, we're really excited that the RISCs have been growing and expanding to other regions. There's now a North Central RISC, a Pacific Islands RISC, a Northwest RISC, and a Southeast RISC currently being established. And so I just wanted to, before I pass the microphone here, if anyone's interested and not already part of our network, we invite you to check out all the resources on our website, including this management document that we're talking about today, and also get on our listserv. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it back to Carrie so she can introduce our speakers today.
Thank you very much. Our speakers today who are going to introduce this management challenge and the concepts behind it are Tony Lynn Morelli, who is a research ecologist for USGS at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, Northeast CASC, and Annette Evans, who is a postdoctoral fellow also at Northeast CASC. Thank you guys. I don't know which one of you is going to start, so take it away.
Okay, thanks, Carrie and Carrie. Yeah, I'm really happy for us to be talking about this today and mostly listening about this today. This is very much, like Carrie said, this is a conversation. So we're just kind of set the stage here and then open it up. I wanted to, in that vein, I wanted to say that the history of us working on this topic is that we've heard from our growing stakeholder and partner base that this topic of resilience is something that is of high interest. And if you didn't know that from your neighbor in science, you knew that, or management, you know that from your the newspaper or just hearing people's conversations, because the word resilience seems to be almost more commonly said than climate change some days. And so it's something that we wanted to take on because it's a topic that is in my background as in climate and about 15 years of working in climate adaptation, something that I've thought a lot about and written about a bit. And then has been in the invasives world for a long time too. So we thought, can we take these on at the same time? And so here's an example of that where we asked in a formal survey, sort of what are the top research topics that our partners are interested in. And this is from a Bury et al. Paper. And you can see that resilient Native communities was right there at the top. So we had a workshop last year to see what does this really mean to people. And we got a lot of good information out of that. And from there, we decided that maybe part of it is just starting from kind of talking about what the heck resilience is in the invasives landscape, in the invasives context, the climate adaptation context, and then of course, where we live in risk, sort of the interface. And so I'll just go through a couple of those definitions in a couple of slides, and then Annette will walk you through our management challenge. The idea of resilience has been around for a long time in ecology. One of the foundational definitions is the ability to experience disturbances or environmental change without changing to a fundamentally different state. So you can picture that in terms of this image where we think about sort of that ball being in one space, and the ball you can think of the system as this ball that's in kind of a dip there. And you can imagine that something could push that ball quite a long ways, but it wouldn't actually end up in a different spot. It would just return, and that is resilience. But if something tips it even farther over this threshold or tipping point, you could end up with a new system. So we can think about resilience as the capacity to recover or bounce back, resile, that's what it means, from a disturbance. That's how we think about it in ecological context in general. So we can think about that both with climate change and invasives. And the climate adaptation world took this on a little bit, thinking about this context in terms of resistance versus resilience. And thinking about essentially, can we think about a system that is so resistant that it never kind of changes? That's the RT here. Versus resilience, where the system actually does get affected, but then comes back to where it was. So resilience is one of several goals for managing for future disturbances or environmental change. And it can be helpful to think of those goals as following along a spectrum. I work on climate refugee a lot, so I think a lot about resistance. That's usually in the resistance option. That's really trying to prevent change. On the other end of the spectrum is transformation or transition, or more and more we're talking about direct in the RAD framework of the Department of Interior. So managing for future conditions, actually kind of like helping them come on so that we don't have a drastic change and maybe catastrophic change. Resilience falls in the middle there. So allowing some change without changing to a different state. We can think about resilience as a management goal in terms of trying to encourage persistence and recovery, and think about how important features or processes that define, that define the desired state of the system. So like habitat type, native species, or function. So with that, I'm gonna hand things over to Annette to walk you through the management challenge we put through with those ideas. And Annette, nice to see your best friend sitting next to you.
Yeah, he's a little needy today. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen.
Looks great.
All right, so I'm just going to spend a really short amount of time just briefly walking you through the management challenge that we did for resilience. So it's titled Embracing the Future, Promoting Adaptation and Resilience to Invasive Species and Climate Change. And I know that Justin put a link earlier in the chat. So if you're wanting to follow along on your own screen rather than the shared screen, feel free to open that up. But essentially, one of the main goals that we had for this management challenge was to try to synthesize the information that was already out there about resilience in terms of a management strategy to tackle both disturbances driven by climate change as well as disturbances driven by invasive species. And so I'm sure those of you that are managing systems, you're well aware of the different challenges there are and the different disturbances that you probably have encountered that are associated with both of these disturbances. And more in the future, we're going to be seeing an interaction between both climate change and invasive species. And so the words that you see up here are essentially the introduction, kind of similar to what Tony Lynn just gave about defining what resilience is, because believe it or not, there's actually a variety of different ways that resilience can be defined. And so for our management challenge, we defined it as the ability of a system to experience disturbance or some kind of environmental change without changing to a fundamentally different state. So that's that cup and ball. Can the ball return to that same kind of cup that it initially started in? But as Tony Lynn mentioned, resilience is just one of a couple of different management options. And so this management challenge sort of compares and contrasts these three different options. And part of today's discussion is to talk about, what are the situations where maybe resistance might be a better management strategy compared to, say, resilience or transformation. And part of that, it depends on what your management goals are and what the system is that you're managing. So just to kind of give you a visual representation of what these three different strategies are, because I always like to have a visual representation. So if we have, say at the top here, our focal system, this is whatever system someone is currently working in. And this system is experiencing disturbances in relation to climate change. So this could be, say, changes in precipitation or fire regime, and then also disturbances associated with invasive species, whether those are plants or animals. And so our three different strategies sort of fall into different categories in terms of like what the ultimate end goal is. So in resistance, we're looking to preserve that original system and all of its functions the way that it has originally or historically been composed and functioned. So usually this involves trying to preserve the native species that define that system and the functions that they preserve. And as Tony Lynn mentioned, often these are areas, say like refugia, where we're really wanting to sort of keep things as they historically were. In resilience, we're looking for a little bit of change in the system, but without a fundamental change. And so an example of this could be, say, a slight change in species composition. So maybe there's some new species that are present in the system. So maybe a couple of invasive species, but their presence and effect don't push the system too far away from what it historically has looked like in terms of structure and function. And then the last one is transformation, where we see quite significant changes in either the biodiversity, the structure, or the function of an ecosystem. And this, under the sort of management approach, we see quite a significant change and maybe even what we would describe the ecosystem looking like. And so another way to present this information is a table. And so again, we're thinking about these three different strategies as a spectrum. So resistance, we're resisting any change in the system. We really want the system to look as close to our historical sort of time point as possible. And then on the opposite end, we have transformation, where we're really facilitating or promoting changes in the system, because we recognize that, you know, there are certain situations, I'm thinking particularly of coastal ecosystems, where we're going to see ecosystem change, and there's very little we're able to do to prevent that. And so I don't want to go through every single part of this table, because I realize it's quite a lot and I don't want to talk at you too long. So I just want to use this table to kind of demonstrate just one example, and hopefully this can get our conversation started. So the example that we have in the table is management strategies for emerald ash borer. And so again, like, it depends on what your management goal is, what your system looks like, but an example of using resistance as a management strategy for emerald ash borer could be the active thinning of ash trees to promote tree health and to minimize the spread of the emerald ash borer. Other options could be chemical treatment of trees to basically improve their resistance against these insects. And as I'm sure you all recognize, there's pros and cons for all of these approaches. And so just as an example, you know, resistance isn't a viable management strategy in all situations, because it's pretty costly to do a lot of these things. And so it might be that you choose to use resistance in a specific ecosystem that has, say, I don't know, trees with a particular genotype, or, you know, a particularly unique ecosystem like a refugia. Second option, again, resilience. So here, there's a little bit of overlap. So some treatments like silviculture treatments like thinning can also promote resilience. Here, we're basically trying to increase the overall health of the ecosystem, again, to make sure that it's not going to be pushed into a new system. So you'll see some slight changes, say, in species composition. So maybe, you know, ash aren't as dominant as they were before, but there's management support for other species that can provide similar ecosystem functions. And then just lastly, thinking about transformation, in certain situations, you know, maybe emerald ash borer is already really widespread in a forest, and it's just not feasible to try to eradicate those populations. So in that case, we sort of have to look into the future and so either using passive management, where it's sort of, you know, let nature take its course and sort of a hands-off approach, or active management, where we can, you know, make active decisions such as translocating species into that ecosystem. We can help facilitate that particular system to move into what we think will be stable in the future. So that's just a really, really brief overview of this 2-page document. I strongly encourage you to download a copy and read through the nuances and the rest of it on your own time. But with that, I'm going to stop and turn this back to the rest of the RISC team to facilitate our discussion today.
Thank you so much for both of you for that clarifying presentation on what we're talking about. To kick off the conversation, I'm wondering if I could ask my colleague Sharon Bachman to say a few words. She actually did a lot of work with emerald ash borer, which is sort of our model insect for this challenge. And I was hoping she could chat a little bit about what some of the different partners in her region did and where they fell along this continuum.
Sure, Carrie. If you wouldn't mind, could you give me co-host privileges to share? I just have like 2 slides to prompt. And so I'm Sharon Bachman. I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Erie County, which is a greater Buffalo area. And these are some pictures from 10 or 11 years ago, some of them that I'm going to share. Actually, if you can see the captions, one is from 2012. And it is one of the first stands that we discovered with emerald ash borer here in Erie County. It's outside of the greater Buffalo airport. And that is one of our DEC foresters on a first detector talk, scraping a tree. That is outside of a golf course near the airport, and it was definitely an inactive managed area. It was something that just periphery of the golf course, and had grown up all to ash trees. So I'm assuming I don't go to that area very often. What it looks like today is probably most of those trees have fallen to the ground. And thinking about the scheme that we're talking about today, it's probably in a transformational phase there just because it's been passively managed. On the right-hand side is one of our Olmsted parks. This is in South Park near our botanical gardens. This is a picture taken this month. It is also one of the first areas that we found emerald ash borer in Erie County in 2011. And you can see some falling trees in there. And what you see in the corner of my slide is what they have up now are slides, phase 1 tree work in progress. And so they're formerly the site had been an arboretum, and then they're in the process of getting the funding to recreate their arboretum at this site. So I would say that there's been some passive management at this site without a lot of, reintroduction of species, but work is being done to kind of move it to the next phase. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Rhinestone Woods. And this isn't officially Rhinestone Woods. Rhinestone Woods is one of our DEC properties here in Erie County. It's kind of in between the two sites that I just mentioned. So it was early on exposed to emerald ash borer, and they began to treat trees early on in the infestation. I believe they would have been within that 5-mile range that Mark Whitmore would have recommended treatments at. And so they've preserved 20 trees through treatment. I heard from their site manager that those treatments have worked well. So they've been doing those for the 10 or 11 years now. And they just completed a site management plan, taking into account all their invasive species, including deer pressure, which is heavy in Western New York. And, I would say that kind of seems like a resilient landscape because they have preserved the ash trees, maybe for some seeds into the future, but they're also helping to transition. They didn't mention if they were planting new species or not. And I mentioned to Carrie that through our Emerald Ash Borer Task Force that formed when our infestations were first detected, we know that a number of our municipalities, I've listed them, Lancaster, East Aurora, Tonawanda, began treating their trees and had the money to invest in that. And they have preserved the ash on their landscapes. I know I live in the village of East Aurora. I see that they have been effective in treating their ash trees. I'm not sure some of the other communities, how effective it has been, but they are more on maybe the resistance side where they've been able to keep their ash. So it's interesting to consider land managers versus municipalities. So those are just some thoughts I had in terms of my perspectives from working for about 10 years now with an Emerald Ash Borer Task Force in Western New York.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Appreciate your time putting that together for us. Do we want to open this up to general discussion or, okay. There's some interesting conversation in the chat about biocontrol and where that falls. I see Matt just had something to say about that. Matt Brinka, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Specifically about biocontrol or just about this in general?
Either way.
No, I was just saying with biocontrol, like I feel like it might be more in resilience because you're introducing a species to control another species. You're not really resorting back to a fully native ecosystem. But thinking about it a little bit more, it might be like a bridge between the resistance and the resilience, especially when you're thinking about, I guess, resistance within like a hemlock ecosystem or something like that. Or maybe it is making it a little bit more resilient. I think it falls a little bit in both. But I did want to say bring up a couple of things. For those who don't know me, I'm Matt Brinka. I'm an invasive biologist for New York State Parks. And this has been on my mind for years, I want to say. And I feel like the more I sit down and talk about it with my colleagues, the more and more questions get brought up. But I wanted to provide a little bit of a frame on what we are to try to get to what questions I have. Because here at state parks, we manage over 350,000 acres, and a lot of that, 90% of that, is natural or undeveloped. And we manage hundreds of habitat types, drastically different from one another, salt marshes to hemlocks. We have hundreds of rare species, both animals and plants, that we're trying to protect in over 100 natural communities of statewide significance. So we have this really diverse, we really touch every single corner of our state. And historically, we focused on resistance. And often that was through restoration, taking an area that we would work in, like Allegheny State Park, which is a massive forest block that is extremely healthy, all things considered. And like we are actively trying to resist invasions, doing a lot of invasions, but at the same time, we are incorporating some resiliency type work in there as well. But often when we do like large scale restorations, we are specifically thinking about restoring them to what they were. And this is historical, I'm talking about in the agency. So restoring a native grasslands at Ganonigan State Historic Site to reflect the historic significance of those habitats to native cultures and the environment, and really heavily relying on native genotypes. And often as an agency, historically, we've thought about, oh, this is like this is degraded. Let us restore it to what it was. And then the more I sit here and think about this, I begin to question, is that ultimately the correct mindset we should do, restoring it completely to what it was? And is that correct or not? What characteristics would we be striving for? Should we restore the habitat, but alter our planting regime to be representative of a habitat that is more south? And what does that even look like? I don't work in Pennsylvania. I don't know the plant makeup or the different densities of different type of plants in those ecosystems. How can I better prepare my ecosystems for what is more south, or what will be the dominant cover in a similar ecosystem? So, like, I know this is kind of like a soapbox type of thing, but like we manage these specific habitats, like for these rare species and specifically for diversity. But when should we be like, transformation has really kind of hindered our brains a little bit. We really don't know how to identify when the correct time is to transition, to actively transition, or to let it passively transition. I think we have a lot of remorse towards that, because we think of what it was and what we're trying to protect, and transition might not be, or transformation or transition might not be part of that. I'm confusing two models in my head. But I guess we do consider like some stuff that we do to be like passive transformation. We are managing barberry a lot less on the landscape in state parks, unless it's directly impacting humans with ticks, like along trails. We've made that conscious decision to not manage it because it provides a valuable habitat to small mammals, often like in the Hudson Valley, in a heavily browsed, degraded ecosystem. And one thing I think we've noticed as an agency too is we're starting to realize like edge and fringe habitat might be a prime candidate for us to begin thinking about transformation, because those are often the first places to be invaded and the first to degrade, honestly. And if we can transform those areas to be more resilient to climate change, we might be able to decrease invasion potential for the future, ultimately protecting our strong, resilient ecosystems that we're trying to protect.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, did you have a thought you'd like to add?
Sure. And I'm just calling in from north of the border. I'm in Canada, and I have a couple of, I was hoping Karina Bernard would be able to join us. I think she was having internet issues, but she's been leading a framework on invasive alien species for Parks Canada. And I think Hillary Harrop-Archibald's on the call as well. And I think we've been sort of moving more towards the RAD model, so the resist, accept, and direct. And I think Tony Lynn, you mentioned that as well. And I think a big part of that is just like resilience. Like even the way, Annette, you described resilience in your talk, the end goal is the same. It's sort of to have a stable state, to return. So resistance and resilience can sometimes be considered sort of the same thing. You're resisting the change to some degree. You're using different techniques to get back to that place. But we found that resilience ends up being kind of a management goal rather than a strategy. So you may achieve resilience through kind of this passive transformation where you accept change and you allow some transition, and you might still see resilience to that invasive alien species if you slow it down a little bit, give the space a bit of time to recover. So we're definitely moving into that idea, and then recognizing that it's not as convenient, doesn't work as well as a nice linear spectrum, because you have to really now go to a triangle, because you can't really think of accept as in between resisting change and directing change. It really is almost orthogonal to both of them. But I think that's been helpful for us, and also kind of acknowledging that strategies what you decide to do doesn't have to fit into one of those categories, because often it's a blend of two or sometimes even three. And often in terms of the way we're managing our spaces, we're using a combination of the three in different places. And I think about invasion, like invasive green crab, where in some places we're really trying to eradicate, other places we're sort of not managing at all. We can't even get there to try and remove them. And then there's sort of a lot of places where we're doing a bit of both. We're trying to remove, but we're wrecking, like resistance is futile in some places. And I think there's kind of RAD has helped us embrace a bit of that change without totally giving up on the end goal of like a stable state where that species is not taken over. But always happy to chat about the Canadian context further. And I know Karina, if she was here, would have a lot to say about it as well. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Gary, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I just, as a person that works as a state plant regulatory official, I'm working on the resistance end most of the time, but I do other things as well. And we just had an Eastern Plant Board meeting in Cooperstown, New York, and a lot was talked about in terms of rapid response and the inability to do it because there are so many blockages in terms of how you're going to manage, especially an invasive insect or a weed, because of the inability for people to accept the risk assessments that are done on pesticides. And that's becoming more and more of a problem in terms of, you get something in, like in New York, you just recently got the box tree moth and the European cherry fruit fly. And it's impossible to go and do any kind of a quick eradication of those species because there's so many different environmental assessments that have to be done before you can do anything. And it's strange because the environmental assessments are done by EPA when they register the products, and if they're used according to the label directions, then they shouldn't be causing unacceptable environmental or human health problems. And, we've gotten to the point now where we've scared the crap out of everybody in terms of pesticides or genetic modification. We had a presentation on the GE chestnut that is getting ready for field trials. And, that could be part of, I don't know if that's transformation or resilience or whatever it is, but, that might be something that will happen with ash as well. And, how does that all fit together? And, there needs to be a meeting of the minds in terms of how we manage pests, not just for this, but even for our food production, because as we, push these things further and further, we're going to get to the point where we can't do anything anymore. And everybody's going to be all worried about everything all the time. And, for me, sometimes I think that people are more likely to get cancer from worrying about pesticides than they are from pesticide residues. But it's, it's just one of those things that I've been thinking a lot about lately and trying to find ways to move in a different direction. And it is, it's really impossible in most situations to keep things out. And we just don't have the resources. Border Patrol doesn't have enough people. We don't have enough people. APHIS doesn't have enough people. And we're always going to keep getting new ones. And just one last example is, they want to ban certain pesticides in Maine, and they're trying to add in an exemption for invasive species, but they want to have a list. Well, I don't know what that list is. I don't know what the next
It'll
invasive
change next
species,
year.
right? What that next invasive species is going to be, and they don't want it to be, held open because they're all worried that somebody's going to use one of these pesticides to control that next invasive that we don't even know what it is. It's an unknown. I mean, it's unreal. But thanks.
Thank you. New York is looking at some similar regulation around imidacloprid, and they've made a carve out for invasive species emergencies very generally, which might be one way around that. I'd like to give our presenters a chance to chime in, and then over to Deb, who has her hand raised next. Is that okay?
Great. I just have some sort of random thoughts, and this might be a dump, and you can just ignore it if it's not useful. But I mean, and then Gary added to my random thoughts. You have to try to organize a little bit. But one of the things about when I was listening to the resilience transformation question is what factors enter into deciding where to stop change? Because if it was a totally natural environment, it would be changing all the time, constantly. I mean, it's a glaciated, the big, glaciation was the big change. People had nothing to do with that. So I went straight to ecosystem services. So you maybe look at, well, what are the ecosystem services that we should preserve, but then should preserve for what? So are these really rare species ones that we should preserve because they're rare and they're interesting, or should we preserve them because they have human value in some way? Or is a particular ecosystem niche really good at filtering drinking water? And how do you decide what to preserve and at what stage to preserve it if you're going for resistance and preserving these? And I'm not saying don't do it, because I'm really all personally for saving those rare endangered species. But I'm just saying, how do you decide? And having a well laid out plan for how to decide could be the make or break for funding, for example. I mean, maybe, but so I kind of look at all of that, and where do you say this is natural transformation? This is something we should allow, and this is, we don't want to allow any kind of transformation because this is too valuable. And then it's not natural anymore, it's engineered basically, and so on. So I guess that I'll stop.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in quickly to say that I just saw another talk by Steve Jackson, who's a preeminent paleoecologist and also the director of the Southwest Cask. And it was a good reminder about deep time and how maybe ecological communities don't exist, you know, and the reminders of sort of the Northeast and Midwest of beach has only been here for 1,500 years. And, you know, it's just like reminders about time, like you were just saying, Deb. On the other hand, it doesn't change constantly naturally in the sense of like what we see in our lifetime, right? So like when we're thinking on thousands and millions of years, change is constant. But I think there's a reason why we had like this historical range of variability and ideas about restoration, because there were places that we thought, you know, over decades, as long as we weren't like they weren't sprawling out or being logged down, weren't changing in like such a radical way as now. But it's so interesting. Like, I think that piece, of course, we could spend days thinking about like, what does it mean in this world of change that we mostly can't, like the ultimate resistance, I guess, is stopping climate change on the mitigation side, right? But that's not, most of us don't feel like that's really in our power. So it's just really interesting to think about that stuff. The change from our context of like ecology and deep planetary history all the way to like this year versus last year.
Annette, do you have anything that you want to chime in with?
I've just been reading through the chat, and I think a lot of people were we also struggled with this a little bit when we were putting together the management challenge. I'm thinking about, you know, this linear scale versus, I really like the idea of this pyramid, you know, like things that sort of fall partially in between, or maybe a combination of the two. And we sort of had that in some of our examples too. So if you think back to the EAB example, you know, you could use like silviculture techniques like thinning either as a resistance strategy or a resilience strategy. And I think part of this depends on, you know, what is the actual management goal? What are you hoping to see? And I think part of that will decide or determine or influence, whatever the right word is, whether resistance, resilience, or transformation, or what combination of those features make the most sense for your particular system. And I think Hillary put in the chat kind of something similar, where I think, you know, having some sites where you're employing a mixture of these strategies, whether it's the RRT framework or the RAD framework. And I think that that's probably pretty common across a lot of systems, just depending on scale, budget, you know, management ability, everything else that goes into management of these ecosystems.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who, oh, Carrie, yes.
Thanks, Carrie. So yeah, I was just thinking about, you know, one of the things with this specific management challenge that we were thinking about as we were writing it is we hear a lot about resilience or resistance maybe not resistance in terms of climate change, but a lot about resilience and transformation in climate change. And then we also think about some of the things we're doing with invasive species. And what was kind of unique about the topic today is that, you know, we're like kind of merging these two worlds of invasive species and climate change. And I was having a discussion the other day about it. And what I thought was really interesting as I was listening to these climate change folks talk is that, like, a lot of times when you're thinking about climate change, you're thinking about, well, you know, things are going to change, and you're thinking like longer term, where I feel like a lot of invasive species management is a lot more immediate, like we're on the ground and we're managing today for tomorrow or for 5-year period. And so, you know, when we're thinking about, you know, we know the climate is changing, and even if we lower emissions, things are still going to continue to change, maybe at a greater pace than it normally would have. And so where does our invasive species planning fit into that longer time frame? When I remember when I first started thinking about this topic like 5 or 6 years ago, and one of the managers, we were having a little conference, asked like, well, so if, you know, this certain region is going to transform to be more of like an dry oak type habitat in the future, why am I even managing for the current species that are there right now? if they're not going to be here, in 50 years or 100 years or whatever time frame the climate person was talking about. And so it was just a really interesting, difference in timeframes that, the invasive species management world and the climate change world think about. So how can we, kind of come together a little more in our vision for the future, and as we're thinking about transformations.
It's pretty challenging. Another place where I've gotten a lot of pushback when I start talking about maybe we should do this thing because the climate models say that X species isn't going to be in X location. It's people, experts in the field saying, we don't know that. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. Why would we, why would we recommend that people cut down all their hemlocks, if they're not based on a guess? And I feel like that's a really challenging position to address. If anybody has any thoughts on how do you say we are confident enough in this that it's time to manage for it, would be really helpful. And after Tony, it sounds like you have something to say, and after that, Karen has her hand raised.
I'm good. Go for it, Karen.
Okay.
I'm Karen. I'm with TNC in Massachusetts, and one of the things that we've been encouraged to think about is, getting at some of the process issues at some of our sites. I'm thinking with one wetland in particular we're managing in partnership with a state, and for years we're just sort of been struggling with beavers and shrub invasion. And the partnership and some additional funding is allowing us to get at really taking out this beaver dam that's built up over decades, and reintroducing the fire and the process that probably should be there, and trying to go a step further than just treating some of the symptoms. It doesn't mean that the invasives are not going to still come in. We're still going to have to treat them, but trying to go a bit deeper into the processes to try to make the site more resilient and so that it can transition in a better way going forward. And I don't think when we started the project we were thinking consciously about climate change, but it just made sense to go a little bit deeper than we had in the management that makes the site more resilient. So.
Thank you very much. We had a suggestion in the chat that we break into separate sessions, but with only 10 minutes remaining, I don't think it makes sense for us to do that in this situation. But maybe we could, in the future, do talks, some coffee talks that are separated by plants versus insects versus animals.
Yeah, this is, I'm sorry, Carrie, I just want to chime in on that note. We're trying this new networking group, Zoom meeting here to talk about some of these topics. And yeah, any suggestions that you have on the format or things you'd like us to do this kind of thing on in the future, please throw those in the chat too, or even send us an email afterwards, because this is kind of an experiment. So thanks for being a part of it.
In the meantime, Laura, I don't know if you're willing to unmute, but I would love to hear. I actually heard your comment. I guess that's probably how you meant it, but I was also just thinking, could you speak a little bit how you think the RAD or the RRT, or however we want to talk about it, resilience, is different with the insects versus the plants versus the vertebrates? We don't talk about vertebrates too much in the Northeast, but I've spent a lot of time with the Southeast RISC lately, and I got a lot of invasive vertebrates down there.
I mean, I can share a pilot that we're going to be trying. You can tell me that I'm nuts. I'm Laura Eaton, and I'm with the National Wildlife Refuge System in the Northeast, and I'm the invasives coordinator. We have been focusing more on plants. I guess maybe for insects, we're thinking there are others that are dealing with that on a larger scale. So
unless there's an infestation that's really affecting a refuge, then we get help from, say, APHIS or something to help us address that. So most of our issues are plants. I'm thinking that, you know, invasive plants follow disturbance, and there's little that isn't disturbed. I started to think about soils and what is the condition of soils, because they're plants. So we're actually going to do a little pilot to see what we learn, to look at the health of soils at some infested locations, such as pH, organic material. And if the soil is not healthy, if there's something we can do to improve the health, the theory being that if you can build a healthy native plant community, is that more resistant to invasion in the long term, which fits in with climate change and new plants coming. So that's kind of what we're playing with right now. I just haven't really seen anybody talk about soils and invasive plants, and it seems that it's a need. It's sort of nibbled at in the literature here and there. We certainly know that invasive plants themselves will change soils, but we've never tried to like look at those changes and ameliorate them so that we don't get yet another invasive plant in behind them. I feel like we're just kind of in this do loop that we can't get out of. So I'm trying to think of invasive plants as a restoration problem to solve, rather than just going around killing invasives.
There was some work done in the Pacific Northwest. We had a Scotch broom infestation when I worked for the Nature Conservancy out there. And the Scotch broom was increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil. And then even after we took out the Scotch broom, what we got back were just this endless treadmill of harder and harder to manage invasives. And so they were looking at maybe the microbial diversity in the soil and what to do. So you might look at the South Puget Sound program out there and see if they had any research that spoke to that.
So I'm very fortunate in that our database manager is actually a soils guy. So I'm working with him, and we're thinking that, you know, if we learn that the pH is not ideal for native plants, that there might be something we can do about that. If the organic material is not what it should be, you might be able to put a cover crop on it temporarily to build up the carbon in the soil, which should bring back the natural organisms. Not much you can do about earthworms. So that's kind of what we're playing with, like first identifying what may not be in the soil, and then decide how we might ameliorate it, and then decide what we might need to do after that. So it's just sort of a learning process, but it seems like for many, many reasons, soils have been impacted, and we don't know to what degree they've recovered. Do you think I'm crazy?
Sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys find out.
So I feel like, you know, plants are kind of a restoration problem. I feel like invasive insects are a different problem and how you would approach it.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who wants to either respond to a previous comment, or Gary, you've got another thought?
Yeah, I guess I would follow up on what Laura said. I don't agree with her. I think that they're all pretty much the same. They all come in for different reasons, but soils could be a factor in terms of insects. They could be a factor in terms of diseases. Soils can have effects on everything. And I mean, if you don't, I think that the biggest problem that we have in invasive species management is people think that they can go out and cut a whole bunch of stuff down and they're all done. And, you know, that's encouraged a lot. And oftentimes there isn't a good management plan behind it to actually follow up and make the change work. And again, it fits right in with this, you know, resistance, resilience, and transformation. And sometimes if you don't do the transformation, then you've you've not finished the work. So I don't know. If you're looking for resilience, I guess, like Matt was talking about, where you're going to prioritize and just take on those places that are most important habitats or something like that, or where you've got an invasive insect that's being promoted by an invasive plant like ticks, then again, if you don't do the final step, then you're not going to get that resilience or that transformation. And I think it's a really important part to make sure that people understand before they take on any kind of projects like this.
Matt, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of Gary, because this is a conversation that I've been having with our biologists and stewardship staff for the past 4 or 5 years or so, is that invasive species are often a symptom of something worse. And simply going in and removing the symptom is not fixing the problem that is there. So the soil thing is interesting to me, even though I think our soil is broken in the Northeast. Earthworms are a huge problem and a driver for a lot of things, and jumping worms and so on and so forth. But we really have to start thinking about the system as a whole, instead of going in and looking at, or the system, not the symptom, the ecosystem as a whole and the habitat as a whole, and not just going in there and removing plants for the sake of removing plants. And I think it's a good story to remove plants and it's flashy, but often that can cause more harm than good, especially if something worse comes in. So that is a huge mindset that is difficult to change, I think, especially when thinking about long-term.
Thank you. Does anybody want to follow on to that? Jordana, have you seen any comments in the chat that we haven't addressed?
There's been a pretty lively discussion in the chat. So yes, but we have 1 minute left. So I don't think that we will necessarily get to it, but that means there's still so much to talk about in this field and space, which is exciting and also daunting.
I'll say as a quick wrap up on my end, and I agree, there's lots and lots in the chat we didn't get to. This is the most climate changey risk conversation I've had in the last 6 years. I don't know if Carrie Brown-Lima feels the same way, but that's pretty great. We often end up kind of like talking mostly about invasives. This was like a mix. And so it's good. I think that was one of the things we were trying to do with the management challenge. I don't know that we nailed it. We made up our own framework, which is always a little dangerous, but really trying to like come together on resilience for invasives and climate change.
Yeah, thank you all. This was really, I learned a lot. It's so interesting to hear what everybody's doing and thinking about this. So yeah, send us some feedback. Maybe we'll follow up with a couple of questions so we can make these kinds of events more useful, or I don't know, but it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. So thanks everyone.
We're really grateful for everybody bringing their expertise and their knowledge to the conversation. And I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you guys so much and have a great week. I hope we'll see you again at another talk.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Carrie, do I need to do anything special to save the chat if I
think you might. Yeah. I think anything that goes in the public chat might wind up in the recording, but I don't know how to get to it.
I just save the chat so I can
thank you.
I can share it with
okay. Great.
It'll save everything. I don't know, Carrie, if you had a private chats that you wanted to save, I can just tell you how to do it.
No, I don't have private. I mean, the private chats were more about just coordination. They weren't anything like any deep thoughts, but I didn't really get to read all the chats as they were coming
I can
in.
also tell you how to do it.
Yeah,
like,
could you
if
tell me how to do it?
Yeah. Okay. So open up your chat as if you're going to chat to everyone.
Okay.
And look all the way over on the right in that bottom area for typing. And there you should see the 3 dots.
Save chat.
Yep. Save chat.
Yeah. So then, and then
Chat
it's hard to
saved.
find where it is. So maybe click that show. You might have to search for it, or when I save it, it gives me for a very brief moment where I can click a thing to show where I put it.
Yes, it did. Okay. It's in this PC. Gotcha. Oh, in Zoom. Okay. Gotcha. All right. I think I got it. But thank you guys. I thought that was really a interesting conversation. I thought it flowed. I don't know if maybe breaking out would have been better, but in a way, since it was our first time, I wanted to make sure like people that were there just to listen were able to listen, because it wasn't like a workshop. We were trying to extract information from people, you know, so it was more like either choose to participate, to listen, or to share. So I don't know, maybe.
I think it might be good in future, now that we've done it once, to pre-set up some very general, very broad categories of breakout rooms that we can deploy, you know, if we need, because once we were at like, oh, we have almost 40 people, I didn't have the bandwidth to be like,
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, right. I know. I was like, wait, Journal's like, maybe we should go into chats. And I was like, I don't know if we can go into chats actually, but it worked out good. I thought it was interesting. And for our first coffee talk, I thought it went really well. I learned a lot. I like hearing the way people are thinking about things.
Thank you.
So thanks, Carrie. Good job. Good job running the show. And yeah, have a great weekend.
You too. Enjoy
guys, I won't be there on Monday. So I don't know if we have an agenda for Monday in our meeting.
I don't recall, but a thing that we should keep in mind is that I think that there isn't a meeting on the 18th. So we should just keep in touch if we think that our group needs a meeting. Because Massachusetts has a day off that day.
Okay.
When is our last thing?
We have an event on May 5th, and then but there's another one. When is our other one?
I don't think we do. I think, wasn't this number 2?
Oh, this was number 2 of 3.
Yeah, with kudzu and then this one. And then...
Kudzu, right, of course. So it's May 5th. Is that right? May?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Or possibly the 4th, out there. So we'll connect before then. Not tomorrow, not next week, but not next week, not the week after, but before May 5th.
Okay, sounds
All right.
good. All right, well, thank you all. All right, have a good weekend.
Well done.
All right, yeah, thanks guys. Bye.